Thank you. The bulk of our approach to violent Islamic ideology rests essentially on two precepts: fix them or kill them. If we can't give them enough economics, religion, law, then we should bomb them. Our perspective is frequently motivated by quid pro quo, this for that. Economic grants are awarded in areas with demonstrated ability for increased security. Religious leaders who embrace nonviolence are given international exposure and greater political standing. Jurists who are perceived as legitimately prosecuting graft are given more responsibility and special powers. At the point when the collective we finds that none of our carrots are working, however, we resort to violence. Both of these, the carrot and the stick, are necessary components of a thorough response to the threat of violent Islamic ideology, but they are not sufficient to stem the steady number of people who are persuaded to terrorize themselves, their families, and their communities. Notwithstanding our best efforts, though, we are failing. It doesn't matter whether your perspective is political, economic, anthropologic, or religious. We are failing to stop the spread of violent Islamic ideology. Our attempts to isolate a state of mind or a geographic location that causes an individual to take on a terrorist ethic has been tenuous at best. What we have found is that the rich and the poor, the weak and the strong, the intelligent and the unintelligent are drawn to places as different as Nawa in Helmand province in Afghanistan, in Raqqa in Syria, in Djibouti in East Africa, in Ma'rib in Yemen, in Beirut in Lebanon, Paris in France, and San Bernardino in California. If you're interested in women's rights, linguistic minority rights, ethnic minority rights, religious minority rights, climate change, access to water, the miraculous inimitability of the Quran, the spread of democracy, or archaeology, then it is obvious that the collective we has failed to consistently deliver on a solemn promise to protect those people and concepts that are most important. The lists here are important, not just obnoxious. There is something that underlies the specifics of a terrorist ethic that we have yet to fully describe, and that has caused me to ask, why do we assume that we are capable of dissuading an individual from pursuing a terrorist ethic? At this point in these kinds of conversations, we often turn to Islam generally and engage in reflections on fiqh and aqidah. Those conversations frequently turn on tafsir and hadith, then devolve to who has the strongest justification for their position. In those arguments, we repeatedly emerge as victorious in our own minds. We proclaim with conviction that terrorists have incorrectly interpreted the Quran, Islamic traditions, human psychology, and the process of building communities. All the while, however, individuals from every walk of life make the choice to subscribe to a terrorist ethic all over the world. Such discussions about how we're right and they're wrong usually miss one important point. Religion is self-authorizing. Religion authorizes itself. It speaks to itself about what constitutes a proper interpretation of religious texts, for example. It is crucial for us to recognize that moments when practitioners of religion turn to outsiders to support or defend their religious principles, they are no longer participating in peculiarly religious behavior, rather something linguistic, psychological, or economic. In short, our attempts to undermine a terrorist ethic fall short for the very simple reason that we are not them. We stand outside their community and objectify, then judge them. And the sort of evangelism in which we tend to participate through a quid pro quo perspective is based on the notion that we have something that they either want or should want. Now, someone might grant my argument but respond, yes, we are outsiders, but we offer a better life than the terrorist ethic. It promotes death and destruction, and we stand for life and freedom. There are a number of problems with that statement, but I'd like to focus on the fact that it assumes that we have something that they should want. It grants that we are outsiders, but it muddies the water by implying that what we have should be so attractive, and it entices them to abandon a terrorist ethic and embrace our ethic. They should want our political and social institutions. But more important than the stuff that we have to offer, this quid pro quo perspective rests on the notion that we have the right to impose our political and social institutions in the unlikely and completely irrational case that individuals don't eagerly embrace our ethic, we have the right financial institutions and the right theology that is so correct that it is self-evident and alluring. In particular, we act as if we have moral authority. Moral authority is the fundamental principle on which we base our counterterrorism strategy. There are all sorts of economic, political, and military policies, but strategy is based on the assumption that we stand in a moral position that legitimizes our desire to fix them. Moral authority is also what legitimizes our killing them. If they won't accept our self-evident and superior cultural institutions, the argument goes, then we are justified when we kill them. Moral authority is the basis of statements like winning hearts and minds, exporting democracy, reforming Islam, and nation building. It makes sense to us that we can export our principles of psychology, religion, and law because we understand them to derive from a moral structure that authorizes us to make consequential statements that will have an impact on a terrorist ethic. Now let me be clear. It is true that we have an obligation to disassemble the terrorist ethic through whatever means are necessary. But authority is a peculiar thing. One of the leading thinkers in authority is Max Weber, and he talked about three kinds: traditional, charismatic, and legal. Discussions about Weber and authority frequently turn to a typologization of different cultures. This culture is being manipulated by traditional authority, tribal. This other culture is being oppressed through charismatic authority, some religious leader. But our authority, the way that we live our culture, is based on legal or rational authority. But rather than doing that, let us recognize that Weber made an implicit point. Authority is endogenous. In every case, authority is based on the willingness of a group of people to collectively dream about the highest purpose of life. Thus far, I have argued that the terrorist ethic is internally constructed and immune to external criticism. Weber's reflection implies that the authority that we feel, that compels us to act boldly in the face of violence, is actually untranslatable to those who participate in a terrorist ethic. It doesn't matter that I translate Ibn Taymiyyah and say that he means X, because I'm not part of the terrorist ethic. My musings about how the Quran ought to be interpreted or Hadith applied to modern life is exogenous to the group I'm analyzing and thus inconsequential. The effectiveness of our quid pro quo approach is frequently diminished because we incorrectly assume that we have moral authority in such a way that it should be obvious to anyone with whom we interact. If I may add a bit of biography to this otherwise probably dry analysis, in my opinion, I think we lose sight of the fact that our best intentions are not immediately obvious to our enemies because we're horrified by the violence that the terrorist ethic embraces. In those moments when I've been faced with mangled bodies, I want to act. I immediately know that my actions are just and they're self-evidently just. It is a mechanism of self-preservation, I think, to blithely skip over one's previously substantiated moral justifications and construct oneself as a superhero in a cosmic battle. But this led me to another question. If moral authority is constructed, and this is my argument, if moral authority is constructed within a group and it's immune from external criticism, who does have moral authority to undermine a terrorist ethic? There are a lot of policy issues that try to answer this question, but I want to bring it to a point that was raised by Bruce Lincoln. And he said that authority is an effect. It's an effect that can only be perceived by those who choose to participate in its construction. If it is indeed the result of like-minded people who fantasize in concert, then it is more accurate to see moral authority as an effect of a continuously negotiated linguistic exercise. No state or coalition has moral authority because moral authority is not a thing to have. The value of a moral argument is for our own purposes. We continually talk about how good at law and religion and politics we are because it makes us feel better. Telling terrorist organizations that they have misinterpreted the traditions of Islam or violated the international social contract is usually ineffective. It may be time for us to avoid analyses that fall prey to mirror imaging. One of the reasons we have held so tightly to our quid pro quo perspective is that we believe that deep down, every person who subscribes to the terrorist ethic should recognize our moral authority. It is significantly more likely, I'm sad to admit, that our protestations notwithstanding, our claims of moral authority are inconsequential.